and yet you go so far as to say there'll be a broadside collapse of China.
Within the decade, most likely. Well, the first piece is demographic. They're now the fastest aging society in history. When they tried to go from the one-child policy to the two-child policy, their birth rate dropped. It's been the fastest industrialization and the fastest urbanization in history. That generates growth once, and now it's over. We stretched our experience over 7 decades. They did theirs in 1. And it was fun while it lasted. Now it's gone. The Chinese Navy is constrained by the first island chain, and those are those islands off the coast of East Asia, so Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, and so on, that they've never been able to punch through, except when the Americans are running the show and they force everyone to be on the same side. So if the Americans leave, that doesn't work. Because the Chinese demography is in free fall, they're completely dependent upon exports, which makes them economically the country in the world most dependent upon ongoing American involvement. This is a country that has almost mined out all of their resources, which makes them the single largest purchaser of every raw commodity in the world. But that requires open markets that are going away. This is a country that imports 80% of its energy, over half of which comes from the Persian Gulf and sails by no fewer than 11 countries that are pathologically hostile to the Chinese, not to mention that the Japanese have a blue water navy and China doesn't. There's nothing about this that works unless the United States holds up the ceiling, and we're done. So think of a normal demographic profile as a pyramid with children on the bottom, young adults, retirees at the top, and mortality builds it into a pyramid. That's how it's looked more or less for the last 6,000 years. More people in their teens than 20s, than 30s, than 40s, than 50s, and 60s. But with the combination of industrialization, urbanization, and now the global order, people have been able to get a bigger chunk out of life for themselves. So they move from the farm into town, they get an apartment. And when space is constrained and you're packed in with a lot of other people, the birth rate drops. So you play that forward 80 years. And in most countries, we now have more people in their 50s than their 40s, than their 30s, than their 20s, than their 10s, than children. And so the whole world is turned inside out. For the countries that have aged like that, now that it's been decades, they're nearing the point where they have more retirees than workers. And when we hit that flip, their economies change. So if you have a lot of young people, it's all about the consumption. If you have a lot of mature workers, it's all about the production and the savings. And if you have if you're full of retirees, it's all about absolutely nothing because there's nowhere to grow. So what's going to happen in just the next 5 years is the world writ large flips from having a younger population of consumers and investors to a retiree population. And we have never seen that before in human history. To this point, only one country has crossed the Rubicon, Japan, and the Japanese economy today is the same size that it was in 1995. Well, they can't improve the economic situation. Right now is as good as it will be in their lives. They're demonizing outsiders. They're persecuting people within their own country that might be brave enough to share a different opinion. That's part of the reason why we're seeing what we're seeing in Hong Kong and the genocide out in Xinjiang. They are preparing their system for a Maoist-style cultural revolution, political and economic disconnect from the rest of humanity. It's going to be ugly. It's going to result in the deaths of literally hundreds of millions of people. But the Communist Party is hopeful that if they can demonize the outside world enough, that they can hold power, and that's all they care about. At the end of World War II, the Americans changed the way the world works. Instead of different empires basically duking it out for populations and resources, we put everything to a big pool and we patrolled the global oceans for everyone so that anyone could play in any part of the world without having to militarize their economy. So they weren't shooting at each other, they could just go. And that generated the greatest economic growth we have ever seen in the history of our species. Now, we didn't do it because we're nice. We did it because it was a trade. You get globalization, you get free trade, you get access to the American market, and in exchange, the United States gets to write your security policies specifically to contain the Soviet Union. And that trade created the world that we know. But the Cold War ended 30 years ago. And for each of the last 4 successive presidential administrations in this country, we've moved further and further away. And now, functionally, it's over. Well, where you are, where physically you live is the single greatest factor that determines everything about your life. So if you live in a flatlands where they get ample rainfall, odds are you're very, very food secure, assuming you're not even a farmer. If you live along a river or at a major port, you're probably more integrated in the wider world and you're more culturally open to other ideas. Part of why the hinterland in the United States is a little more conservative than the coasts. If you live in the mountains, you probably really don't like it when other people stick noses in your business, and you're probably fairly insular. And you add up factors like this, everything from your environmental circumstances to rainfall patterns to the heat patterns, and it shapes who you are. Now, one thing that has changed in the last 80 years is the United States has said it doesn't matter. With the global order, we said that everyone can play. And while some geographies are more economically viable than others, and so generate larger powers that become empires, with the global order, we smashed all of them and allowed everyone to play, no matter how weak the countries were. So it was no longer a world of Japan and Germany and Britain and France. It became a world full of places like Chile and Brazil and Spain and Italy and Libya, Syria and Vietnam. Without the Americans setting up the world in its current format, none of these small countries would have ever made it. Germany is an interesting place. We all know it, of course, from history. It's one of the more warlike places because they're in the middle of everything and they have to be aggressive if they're going to survive. If they wait for someone else to move first, they will always be outnumbered and outgunned and surrounded. But then World War II happened and they were forcibly reconstructed by the Allies. And so Germany today is neo-pacifist, and their general feeling is if it becomes a military competition, we've already lost. So they want to keep the competition economic and financial so that their larger size, their better geography, their more economically viable firms can dominate. And in the world of the global order, that's a good play because if the Americans are outlawing war in Europe and are protecting the Europeans from the Russians and from one another, then the military question isn't even on the table. And in that environment, the Germans have restructured their entire system to maximize benefit. And it's worked very, very well. And that's why Germany is the Germany that we think of, the Germany of industry and exports and manufacturing. But if you remove the Americans from that equation, it all goes to hell. And the only way that Germany continues to exist is by putting the military question back on the table and looking out for its own interests. And the last 11 times that has happened, it has ended badly. France is on the flip side. At the end of World War II, France was the least interested country in what the Americans were offering with the order because, like the United States, they've got a great geography. They've got navigable rivers, fantastic farmland, good local resources, access to the Mediterranean. This is a country that has been a world power for the last several centuries without any help, thank you very much. And then the Americans came in and said, geography doesn't matter. Everyone can play. And in that world, everything that made France special ceased to matter. But now remove the Americans. All of a sudden, geography comes back with a vengeance. And unlike the Germans who retooled everything, the French retooled nothing. So this state-managed economic system that we see as a negative right now in a post-globalized world, that's the way to go in Europe. And they never changed anything.